Yesterday, I covered a rumour that the PlayStation 5 had been reworked. This rumour started because a user on Twitter with a very good track record, his name is Aesthetic Gamer, claimed that Dino Crisis had also been delayed because the PlayStation 5 had seen a rework of some description to the console. Well, this rumour quickly started to spread around the internet, leading many to speculate what this could actually mean. Does this mean that the PlayStation 5 specifications were different versus the 36 compute units that we'd already known about? Furthermore, because everything happens at once, of course, Rogame also made an interesting discovery. He is also on Twitter, but also posts a lot on Reddit, and he discovered a mysterious new APU. The performance of this device were under what we expected for the Xbox Series X, but there were a lot of correlations with Microsoft's device. This led many to wonder, is this some type of APU pertaining to the Xbox Series S, which would be the lower-end Xbox in the next-generation family? Well, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing just those topics because I have several very interesting updates. Now, before we get into the video proper, there are a couple of caveats. The first is I want you to take some of this information with a truckload of salt. I did some digging, I discussed things with Rogame plus several other industry insiders, and basically I think I have somewhat of an understanding of where all of this stuff came from. But it's possible that the retail console and their configurations could be different from here. So I'm not here to sell you snake oil, I'm just here to try and let you know at least some of what's been going on. Furthermore, I have no real direct interest in which console is more powerful. I've owned all of the PlayStation consoles, all of the Xbox consoles, and plan to buy both next generation consoles. And honestly, I'm more of a PC gamer as well. So for me, I'm more interested in just the technical side of this, and also, of course, to provide as impartial as I can anyway coverage to you all. I'm also going to be starting with the Xbox side of the equation, because while it's not simple, it's actually the easier of the two consoles to begin with. Typically I cover things alphabetically, but today is not one of those days. What we know from internal testing documentation from AMD, which I have seen, and also what several sites are reporting, such as Windows Central, Microsoft's next-generation Xbox Series X, is sitting around 12 T-flops of performance. I have personally also seen documentation almost certainly official and from Microsoft, which claims that the higher-end Xbox, this was, just to clarify, for very early on in the console's development cycle, likely before there was anything close to working silicon, would target 10 T-flops plus as a minimum. There were also reports that there's a lower-end Xbox, which has been known as Lockhart for its codename, though others prefer to call the console Xbox Series S for obvious reasons. This device was reported on websites such as, once again, Windows Central, and is supposedly sporting 4 T-flops-ish of compute performance. I've also seen this system listed in internal documentation, which does date back to the midpoint of June of last year, but honestly, information here is very incomplete to get any idea of what the performance of it would be. My biggest issue with this console existing, though, is that Phil Spencer himself has said that the console is not in development, despite hinting that there were multiple Xbox SKUs at E3, and also all of these other reports. This is potentially because developers, the rumour is anyway, didn't want to worry about developing on another SKU, particularly given there was, allegedly anyway, complaints that 4 T-flops just wasn't fast enough. It's hard to know then whether this project will ever see the light of day, or whether things will be handled for the lower end with Project xCloud. The thing is though, the rumours persist and they are now back on the table, especially when we talk about this particular APU, which was once again spotted by Rogame. He told me about this before it was made public, but frankly the PlayStation craziness was just, well, eating up most of my time, and I also wanted to do a bit more digging about both subjects, especially the Xbox, given it was so weird. He and I have been discussing this more in DMs, and a couple of other insiders as well have been weighing in on this, and honestly, this APU is very mysterious. Rogame himself put a comparison against the Sabor Z Plus, but it's doubtless the more powerful device by quite a considerable margin. It's roughly on par with an RX 5600 XT in terms of graphics card raw horsepower, but the CPU performance is faster, about on par with the i7 9700K, much faster than that of the Sabor Z Plus. Looking over these results, Rogue Game assures me that the clock frequency is being misreported, but the GPU speeds are not being reported at all, which tells us lots of useful information. And yes, I'm British, I'm being sarcastic. The memory was also called into question by quite the number of people. After all, it says 12GB and 4GB for main memory and graphics memory respectively. Honestly, this is the least puzzling of all the things we see here. It just doesn't really mean much, because it's likely dynamically allocated by drivers and operating systems. Long story short, Windows for your desktop is not a console OS, and this was tested with Windows on a desktop-like environment with Firestrike, which is also not a console game. In other words, this is being tested with software which is not designed for unified memory. So likely what's happened here is we're looking at 16GB of GDDR6 memory, which is simply being shared between the two, with 12GB allocated for main system memory and 4GB for the graphics. Another interesting result is that there's no SMT support. It's disabled, very odd for Zen processors, Zen 2 processors in particular. Only the lowest of the low-end SKUs have SMT disabled for Ryzen 3000, and the graphics result for TimeSpy, both private and new scores, are around the 7.1 mark, 7100, which puts it in the same class as, let's say, a 1660 Super from Nvidia, or an RX 5600 GPU, as I mentioned a moment ago. So, what does all of this mean? Is the APU an Xbox derivative, or something entirely different? Well, as I said, I was speaking to Rogue Game and a few others in private, and honestly, we cannot find a compelling piece of evidence for a definitive yes, it's Xbox, or no, it's not. If I had to guess, and please note I am very much guessing here, this is potentially a candidate for an Xbox APU which is running in backwards compatibility mode. Basically, it's being tested to see how it handles things. In terms of raw performance, the GPU here would be more powerful than an Xbox One X, largely thanks to it being RDNA based, but it wouldn't be so much so that it's out of line with the console. This potentially means that it's being used to test things like how dynamic resolution and stable frame rates would be affected given a more powerful GPU in, let's say, the Xbox One X. Essentially, that's what's happening. Given clock speeds, which are also potentially being tested for silicon tolerances as well, seeing how the APU responds to things like heat output stability and scaling would make sense. There is, however, another potential possibility, and that is that the Xbox Series S Silicon is what this is. The problem is, though, I find the lack of SMT most irksome. It would mean that the games themselves would need probably a bit of tweaking for the development, much more than if the clock frequency was different. I'm not going to go deep into optimization here, but long story short, for the 8th generation consoles anyway, there was one or two main threads scheduling the work dynamically across the other CPU cores. I guess what they could do is flag the code to behave differently, but it would likely be a lot more tricky to optimize it, compared to, let's say, if you were to say, hey, this is running on a lower end Xbox device, the CPU frequency is 300 MHz less, for example. Let's simply reduce the draw distance and a few other settings here to lessen the CPU load. And yeah, the clock frequency as well is not lower than the Xbox Series X from what we know about. So this probably tells me that they're testing things and trying to figure out what the silicon is capable of, and basically just trying to get an understanding of what's going on if we are talking about an Xbox backwards compatibility. Sony are known to have different modes of GPU operation for the PlayStation 5. Basically, the GPU runs with different configs based on whether the console is running PS4, PS4 Pro, or native PS5 games. From what I gather though, the Xbox behaves quite similarly. The Xbox documentation that I have is less complete, but there are several mentions in one I have which details different GPU generations, and in other words, Gen 1, Gen 0, and so on, which would basically indicate backwards compatibility. Understand, I am not certain about this. We are basing this off frankly way less than ideal information. It could be an entirely different device, like an APU for a desktop for example, or maybe an APU designed for an entirely different purpose, such as say a custom design for a non-gaming device. So, other than Xbox, is there any other potential possibilities? Well, most definitely. One of those is a desktop-based APU such as Van Gogh. Unfortunately, we know very little about the target specifications of Van Gogh. Komachi on Twitter did discover device listings in drivers and other software, which seems to indicate that Van Gogh is using the second generation of RDNA, it's 10.3.2 for its device ID. Would correlate with the device IDs that we do know about for the second generation of RDNA, so that would be Nave 21, 22, 23, and so on and so on. Okay, what about the PlayStation 5? Well, as I mentioned, despite the Xbox being not exactly 100% clear, the PlayStation 5 is as clear as mud. So with the PlayStation 5, as I said, a lot of this started because Aesthetic Gamer claimed that according to his insider information, and once again he has been pretty accurate in the past, including predicting that there would be a new Resident Evil on the way, and that seems to have been confirmed. He also predicted that there will be a new Silent Hill, and Konami have indirectly anyway confirmed that this is the case, and so on and so on. You can look through the posting history of himself for yourself. That was a terrible sentence. But anyway, you can look through it yourself, and he has been fairly accurate in the past. Anyway, he claims that the PlayStation 5 was being reworked, but after like 1 billion people, I assume, messaged him and asked him to clarify those statements, including myself, instead he said that reworked isn't an ideal way of describing it, it's more replanned, although he didn't elaborate as to what exactly that means. But he also provided insight that this was not in 2019, it actually took place way before that, most likely, and I'm reading between the lines here, probably quite early in the development cycle of the PlayStation 5. Now you do need to take into consideration that consoles, they don't take 5 minutes to design and then put together and then release. They take quite a long time, because not only do you need to do things like actually figure out what target specifications you're trying to reach, but then you need to do things like actually developing the software development kit for that to enable developers. You need to actually test the APU, then start tweaking it, and so on and so on and so on. This stuff does take a long time. So currently I'm shooting messages backwards and forwards from multiple people in the industry, a couple of whom have told me some information. I'll get into some of that in just a moment, but some of the others I'm still sending messages backwards and forwards, and hopefully I will get some insight. Unfortunately, there is some language barriers with a couple of chaps, so that makes it a little bit more difficult. Anyway, one person who did get back to me was Komachi. He's very well known in the industry for providing leaks. He gave a lot of leaks for the PlayStation 5, as well as a heck of a lot just in general for AMD products, Intel products, Nvidia, and so on and so on. He and Tim Apisak are very well respected, and I speak to Komachi quite a bit via DM. He and I started talking last night, and I asked him if he'd heard anything about an updated APU for the PlayStation 5. He told me no. 13F9 was added to the Oberon device ID in February 2019, so something may have changed at that point, but he doesn't have any insight into if there is a more updated APU than the 36 compute units Navi 10 Lite that we all know about. Furthermore though, another thing that's quite interesting is he said he's heard through the grapevine that originally Sony were testing with Vega in the original design for the PlayStation 5. Most likely this was really early in the console's life cycle and was never intended to go onto retail shelves like that. I'm kind of guessing here based upon this information, but you may recall, if you're a long-time viewer, that my Radeon 7 leak, where I leaked basically the existence of the card prior to any official announcement, it was an exclusive, that AMD basically put this card out because Navi was being pushed back. This was before that cards like the RX 5700 launched. Anyway, what was quite interesting about this is this was backed up by another source of mine. They told me that, well, Navi 21 and 23 existed. Indeed, they told me that AMD internally were calling the second generation of RDNA the NVIDIA killer, which is actually interesting because AMD themselves seem to have backed this up, stating that they want to disrupt 4K gaming. But what's interesting is this same source also told me that the bring-up for the first generation of RDNA had been a bit of a nightmare. There was a lot of problems and a lot of retapes, so potentially that could be one of the reasons that originally they were testing with Vega. It was never intended for the final console, and this probably did not even impact the launch of the PlayStation 5. It just meant that Sony at the time did not have working RDNA silicon to test the PS5 with, so the best thing they could do is kind of just mess around and use Vega. I don't want to tread over too much old ground here, but my AMD Radeon and ray tracing plan video, which is a little bit out of date I admit, but the basics still seem fairly accurate, did go into this much deeper. If I'm not a twit, I'll remember to link it in the description of the video. My guess here is that Sony were figuring out the target specs of the PlayStation 5 and used Vega to do it, and quickly abandoned the hardware as we got closer to silicon, which was more like what the final PlayStation 5 would look like. Indeed, we know that early development kits, like with let's say the Xbox One SDK leak back in 2014, really and truly used substitute hardware early on. In the case of the Xbox One, for example, they used a discrete desktop GPU which closely matched the Xbox hardware target, albeit with specific drivers and software, and yes, I am simplifying this to keep everyone onto the same page. So, what does this mean? Has the PlayStation 5 seen some type of bump in performance? Or is it still what we've already seen, 36 compute units? Well, frankly, things become way more complicated. And, well, here we go. The PlayStation 5 internal testing documents date back to the midpoint of last year, and there were two sets of core specifications outside things that were tweaked for backwards compatibility testing. There was one set which was 36 compute units at 2 GHz with 448 GB per second of bandwidth, and the same specs albeit with 512 GB per second. They look to have a 256-bit bus. I believe this is an APU which is being tested and not a desktop-based GPU, such as the RX 5700, which also has 36 compute units, because of differences in device IDs, the references of the GPU itself, it's known as an iGPU, plus lots of other stuff. Plus, of course, the series of APUs and benchmarks, which all seem to tally up with the PlayStation 5 having these specs. I will also take a moment to have a caveat. Whether the retail console has these specifications, even 36 compute units at 2 GHz is, well, up in the air. A few people I'm speaking to, including Foe, insist to me that these specs are not correct and the PlayStation 5 is more powerful than this. And someone else, who does not wish to be named, insists to me that the PlayStation 5 did get redesigned since these tests, these internal tests, which would mean that this is a redesign outside of the aesthetic gamer redesign, which is a lot of redesigns. Long story short, this leaves us with a lot of possibilities, and I'm not going to tell you which one is true, because honestly, several people who typically are well respected in the industry all contradict each other here, but there are variants of these rumours, but they all basically tie down to these few possibilities. The first possibility is that the leak we saw, internal testing documents, was accurate and still is accurate. 36 compute units at up to 2 GHz. This is, once again, for development kit, so it's potentially possible retail consoles will be lower speed. Up to 512 GB per second bandwidth and based on the first generation of RDNA, but does have some elements of RDNA too. CPU is around 3.2 GHz. It's also, however, possible that Sony caught wind of what Microsoft were planning and increased the performance of the machine. This is not impossible. After all, Sega ironically did this with the Saturn, in adding additional processing power because the PlayStation 1 was so capable. That's one very infamous example. There are also people who claim things like this paste bin leak is accurate, such as Sony having a Jaguar-based CPU originally with an 8 T-flop RDNA-based GPU, although I am positive that this is absolutely nowhere close to being accurate, because the CPU would be super duper weedy. Even if the Jaguar processor was clocked at 4 GHz or 4.5 GHz, it would just be stomped by Zen, and certainly Zen 2. I did some testing on this recently as well to demonstrate just how underpowered a Jaguar was. There is another potential possibility, and that's that Sony had multiple prototypes. Once again, this is not impossible. Sega, once again, did it for the Dreamcast, for example, where 2 machines were being developed simultaneously, one in Sega of Japan, one of Sega in America. And you can see the specs on screen as an example here. The problem is, though, that no one has leaked anything credible regarding these specifications, and quite frankly, there's several things in this claim anyway which look a bit off. Prototype A has too small of a die. Prototype B states it's based on RX 5800, and there's no such thing. Higher-end AMD GPUs are almost certainly the RX 6000 series. The die still looks a bit small for this number of compute units. Oh, and Prototype B's 512 GB per second, we see in internal testing documents with a CU layout of 36 compute units. It's possible that Sony were just testing things, and this is a bit old of a leak, but still, I'm kind of skeptical. Hardware takes time to bring up, and the Xbox One SDK analysis I did back in the day kind of explains this in more detail. Essentially, in April 2012 to February 2013, developers were using target PCs as the specification. In other words, CPUs, GPUs which were essentially PC hardware. The APU was still being designed, likely being tested internally, with outside studios not having any real access to it, potentially with the exception of the odd first-party team here or there. Beta hardware was then plonked out in 2013 February. This is with the actual APU. And then we saw an increase in the CPU clock speed to 1750 MHz. This took place in August. So basically, the hardware with the APU came out in February. Then we saw a GPU clock speed increase to 800 to 853 MHz about a month later in March. And then the CPU clock frequency increased in August of 2013, which was really close, of course, to the launch of the system. My point is, I suppose it's not impossible for Sony to have redesigned the APU of the PS5. And it would be interesting, though, why there's not been any real solid information to a more powerful APU at this point. And by which I mean anything that's tangible in terms of a specification. Instead, it seems to be so many leaks based on the old spec. This is now just 9 or 10 months prior to the launch of the retail system. It would also be expensive for Sony to have redesigned the APU, assuming they didn't have a couple of prototypes. The internal testing documentation would also likely mean that the APU is getting close to final silicon being tested. But I would also love to see what would happen if someone leaked the timeline of the console's bring-up, especially if there is another piece to this puzzle that we're missing. What's the bottom line here then? basically, the PlayStation 5 specifications are still somewhat up in the air, to be honest with you. Because while we have information from the internal testing documents which do date back to the midpoint of last year, several insiders, to me anyway, consistently state that the specifications of the PlayStation 5 are not those. The problem is, when I start asking them further information, they tell me they either can't provide that information, or they don't know exactly what has been changed, only according to their friends at AAA Studios. And they do actually tell me what studios that they are working at. Unfortunately, for obvious reasons, I can't provide details as to what those studios are. They are finding the performance and the console is outperforming what the specifications we are seeing would lead you to believe. How it will compare against the next generation Xbox is a bit of a mystery. The Xbox design is slower in terms of the GPU is clocked at a slower speed, but also much wider with many more compute units. Once again, this is assuming that the 36 compute units of the PlayStation 5 are correct and the 52 or 56 compute units of the next generation Xbox are correct. This likely means that certain tasks will be faster on the Xbox, but also certain tasks will be faster on the PlayStation 5. There's also the potential possibility that we could see a PlayStation 5 Pro at launch. The problem I've got with this, though, is that Sony themselves seem to have shot down the idea largely, stating that most likely it's going to happen a couple of years after the PS5 launches. And the other thing, and this is not a definitive answer by any stretch of the imagination, is that Sony seem to want to get as much of an uptake of the PlayStation 5 as possible. They want people to transition from the PS4 or PS4 Pro, whatever, to the PlayStation 5 as fast as they can possibly do it. Now, obviously, that's not really telling us anything about the specifications directly, but it would also kind of make sense if Sony are targeting a lower specification point, because obviously the larger the APU, the more RAM you've got in there, and so on, increases the cost of the machine. And also, this is not pertaining to either console directly. Instead, I guess it's more of a general statement for both next-generation systems. But there are a couple of predictions floating around the internets right now that the next generation of consoles, so that would be the PlayStation 5, the Xbox, so on, will not drastically improve the visual quality of games over the next several years. And I must say that I heavily disagree with this notion, because it's not just things like, oh, we have higher resolution and better quality textures, which of course do largely impact the visual quality of the games, but you also need to take into consideration other factors as well, not least of which ray tracing. And ray tracing, depending how it's used for the next generation consoles, and honestly, we haven't really seen anything that could be really considered a great indicator of that yet, it might drastically improve the visual quality of games. And then there's other factors, just like denser foliage, which actually will move with your characters, better physics, better AI, and yes, I know AI is not really visual, but still, you get my point. Denser crowds, just an overall richer game environment. And I think that visual quality is going to see a massive increase as well. Not just in terms of the density of pixels, in other words, 1440p to 4K or what have you, but just as important as the density of pixels, it's what you're actually doing with those pixels. This is a really silly example, but you can go back and run something like, I don't know, Quake 2 at 4K. But it doesn't look as good as like a modern game at 4K, right? And you can of course then compare Quake 2 with the native renderer without ray tracing versus Quake 2 with ray tracing. You can see the massive visual disparity. Yes, they are still 4K, and the underlying geometry is the same, but the visual quality has increased dramatically. And I am using Quake as a very extreme example. Obviously, it's a makeover of an extremely old game, but I am using it simply to illustrate a point. Just small things, what seem like small things, add ray tracing and a few other effects, that won't make much of a difference. Yeah, it does. So I think the visual quality is going to increase dramatically with the next generation. But as always, it's probably going to take several months, maybe even a couple of years for games to really take advantage of this power. Just like the current generation of consoles, it took developers 1-2 years to really start to, for example, tap out what the PlayStation 4 could do. If you want some more detailed information about that, well, I'm speaking to someone who's rather knowledgeable of the industry, you can check out my recent interview with Neil Trevitt, who is one of the seniors over at Nvidia, and also the head of Kronos Group. So that's a very interesting interview. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. Anyway, I think that just about covers things for this video. Hopefully, you found it at least somewhat enjoyable and somewhat educational. If you did, then of course you know what to do. Click the like button, because that helps us out a ton. After all, it's YouTube land. And also, give the video a share on your social media platform of choice. I will also close out the video by stating that I'm very thankful for you to watch it and giving your time to us. And you can also find us down below in the description on a Patreon if you decide to help out the channel. Of course, that's totally down to you, and various Amazon affiliate links. So if you need to buy, I don't know, like a new lawnmower. I don't know why I use the example of a lawnmower, but if you want to buy a new lawnmower or something like that, then use one of those Amazon affiliate links and it helps us out. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.